Welcome back to MidEast In-Depth, part of Levant TV's press reviews. According to some, Iraq appears to be slipping back into civil war, and Sheikh Zaydan al-Jabiri, one of the political leaders of the Sunni insurgent group known as the Tribal Revolutionaries, seems confident that his side is winning. Let's see what's been said in the media and talk to an expert. David Ignatius writes in the Beirut-based Daily Star a column titled "Brutal Sectarian Warfare Has Returned to Iraq." He says with Iraqi parliamentary elections scheduled for Wednesday, war has come back with a vengeance to that shattered nation, but this time there's no US military around to broker a truce. The last US troops left 3 years ago, and war-weary Americans would gag at the thought of returning to such a pitiless battlefield. Ignatius says brutal sectarian war has come again to Iraq, and the Iraqi military isn't strong enough to fend off the Sunni insurgents, so Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is relying increasingly on Iranian-trained Shiite militias. As the Sunni fighters push toward Baghdad, they are turning to extremists for help, some of them linked with the Al-Qaeda affiliate often known by its Arabic acronym Daesh, for the Islamic State in Iraq and Greater Syria. 15,000 fighters don't have extremist support, but other Iraqis say that the jihadists have been on the front lines, especially in Fallujah, at the gates of the capital, Baghdad. Ignatius questions how did such catastrophic violence return to Iraq. That's really the saddest part of the story. He concludes the United States helped engineer Maliki's re-election as prime minister in 2010, but once the Americans had left, Maliki's government foolishly created a vacuum that allowed Sunni extremists to take root again in western Iraq. Mustafa al-Kadhimi is featured in AlMonitor in a piece titled "Sectarian Discourse Dominates Iraqi Election Politics." The sectarian ethnic and party quota system that has dominated the Iraqi government over the past years has led to a number of problems in the country's young democratic experiment. In this regard, one must acknowledge that the idea of consensual democracy in a divided society has been ineffectively applied in Iraq. Political consensus and partnership in government should be based on implementing agreements and programs, not the sharing of positions and ministries, converting them into private estates for this or that party or sect. The major problem is the absence of responsibility, which becomes more apparent during elections by examining the electoral programs and the competition to attain power. Political parties do not seem to understand that they are then supposed to represent not just their voters but all citizens, including those who voted against them and those who did not vote at all. The writer says elections are meant to translate the popular collective will into a working mechanism. The danger that Iraq faced after 2003 was the inability of parties and movements to interact around a collective will with divisions along sectarian and ethnic bases. Thus, they opted for a consensual democracy as the way to achieve the desired interaction among the different wills of Iraq's components. Kadhimi concludes the forces that represent the Iraqi components have failed to produce a roadmap that guarantees the rights of everyone on the basis of citizenship. They have also failed to dispel the fears that democracy is the rule of a sectarian or ethnic majority, not that of a political majority. These forces have put their own interests before the interests of Iraq's component parts, and thus before the interests of Iraq as the framework for these components. This has led to the country being stuck in the current state of never-ending, excruciating crisis. And joining us today is documentary filmmaker and anti-war activist David Lowley-Wakelin. David, Mustafa al-Kadhimi says in AlMonitor, political consensus and partnership in government should be based on implementing agreements and programs, not the sharing of positions and ministries in Iraq. Do you agree, and don't you think sharing ministries is a step in building that partnership?
Well, yes, but I think what the author is trying to say by this remark is that, these government bodies and partnerships should be have programs and agreements which are written down, and then these are then become government propositions which people then follow by the letter, not the sharing of positions and ministries amongst one's friends. So it's like he's suggesting, inadvertently in this article, that there's a lot of corruption that still goes on. Once a politician has got his job within the government, he then shares out the work amongst his friends, with financial gain and interest from a business angle, rather than an angle that looks after the whole of the voters, not just the ones who voted for him. You know, in other words, once someone's in power, he then takes that power, shares all the jobs amongst his friends and the businesses amongst his friends in a corrupt sense, and doesn't do what he's supposed to do, which is sharing the power or giving out programs, government programs, that can then be run and shared fairly amongst all the people of the country.
Mm-hmm. And David, how could we relate the sectarian rift in the country to the US and UK war on Iraq?
Well, this is a point that when Iraq was invaded back in 2003, and the Americans and the British and so on went in there, the place was obviously became a vacuum of emptiness and was lawless. There was all the prisons were let out, and we had all these gangsters running all over the place. And it was only when the Shia majority in Baghdad managed to get hold of things that obviously Maliki was able to then step up and become the Shia representative and the Shia prime minister after that time. But it left very much the Anbar province over in the west, and the Fallujah in particular, the Sunni side of the country, segregated. One thing that Saddam Hussein, you know, as evil and bad as he was, he did hold the whole country together. And it didn't matter which sect you were from, it didn't matter if you were Sunni or Shia or Kurdish, everyone lived together. And it was a much, much happier and actually under Saddam Hussein than it is now. You know, we're now currently seeing in Iraq more violence than it was during the worst times of 2007 and 2008. Mm-hmm. So what it just did, this invasion by the Americans and the British, was leave a vacuum which has been filled since then, more or less, by the Shia population, which is, of course, the majority in the eastern side of the country.
Mm-hmm. David Lowley-Wakelam, maker of The Alternative Iraq Inquiry, a documentary film alleging that Tony Blair is a war criminal. Thank you very much for being on Press Review.
Not at all. Thank you.
And for more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.